Let's see. So we're just gonna wait till people start popping up, and then I'll start doing introductions. Meanwhile, it gives me a little time to get ready here. But yeah, let's see here. Looks like there's one person right now. So we're just gonna be going over basically my thoughts on Corona-Chan, for lack of a better term. Um, Whoever's listening, let me know how audio is, because I can't really tell. Um, at least the way that I'm doing this live stream right now. If audio is really bad, please let me know. But yeah, I got some points here. Yeah, so yeah, I'm just gonna wait a few minutes to actually get into it. Just see how many people show up. I'm gonna kind of just view Twitter here real quick, just to see who's coming in. But yeah, this is my first time doing a live stream or anything like this, so let's see how it goes, I guess. But yeah. So yeah, whoever's watching this, if you could just let me know in the chat, or also just let your friends know if you think this is worth anything. Yeah, just share it around, see if anybody cares to listen. But, I'll just wait a couple minutes and then I'll go ahead and get started, just to see how many people get here. But I mean, it's not like a lot of people have anything to do, right? Corona-Chan has pretty much canceled everything at this point. Pretty much made it hard for everyone to do anything at this point. And yeah, I'll probably just be focusing on how Corona has basically impacted, I guess, a lot of things that people take for granted, or people don't really think about, and then try to apply that to any philosophy or philosophical ideas that involve the Corona. For example, I know a lot of quote unquote accelerationists are having a great time with Corona-Chan, but I'm calling their bluff. I think they're kind of full of it at this point. But yeah, I'll get into that in a bit. Let's see. And I'm just gonna wait until more people start showing up before I start doing anything formal. So if you want to go ahead and share this with anybody, please do. That always helps the channel. But yeah, let's see. I'll just wait a couple more minutes. I'll probably wait till it's 9:04. I'll probably wait till 9:05 to actually fully get started here. In just 5 minutes for people to roll in. Yeah. Let's see here. Let me actually do something real quick. If you can hear this, I'm so sorry. Also, let me know again, like I mentioned, how the audio is, because I don't want this to sound atrociously bad once I play this back, because I honestly don't know what the audio is like at this point. And so yeah, if it's terrible, I'm super sorry. I could have done more with audio, but I'm kind of limited here in the equipment that I have. So for right now, hopefully this is enough. And also, if you guys need me to like speak up or anything, please just let me know. I'm more than happy to basically speak up or be as loud as I need to be. But looks like it's 9:05. I'm gonna post this link to see if more people roll in, but then I'll get started. Let's see. How would I do this? Oh, I'm trying to post this on my bio. Nope, it's not gonna work. Um, yeah, I don't know. Whatever. I'll just get started. And okay, so basically, I made this podcast because I wanted to see. Well, it's not even a podcast; it's a live stream. I made this live stream because I wanted to talk about Corona because I know a lot of people are kind of talking about it, obviously in the news, and everybody's either home quarantining themselves or not taking those risks. And for example, I know a lot of people that, well, not a lot of people, but I know some people that have actually traveled during this time, and it's like, oh man, you're really out here, huh? Trying to risk it all. But um, basically, I'm just gonna be answering some of the questions that people asked on Instagram. And if you don't follow me on Instagram, the primary Instagram that I use is at Cornosaurus, which is my main Instagram. It's the Instagram that I've always used. Um, and yeah, uh, the first question is, do I think this was planned? And it's one of those things. It's like I think it's very easy for people to think that something like like a bioweapon is something that can happen just because we see it sometimes like in mainstream media, or we see it in like in movies, or we read it in books, and we think, oh man, like if someone could do it, and then it would cause catastrophic damage to society as we know it. And it's not that it's impossible. My only thing with whether or not something like this, like Corona, if it was weaponized, for example, um, is that I don't think that governments, for example, or like a terrorist group, for example, would one have the basically the capital or the means to actually implement something like this. Because you think how much money it costs to actually, for example, like develop a vaccine. Now imagine the type of money that you would need to develop something like a virus, like weaponize one, create one that's resilient to particular treatments. You think, oh man, like there must be a lot of resources that would go into that, and you could think maybe governments haven't the resources to do it. Um, but I'm really quite skeptical about something like that. And the reason is, one, you would have to, like I mentioned, have a lot of resources to dump into something like a bioweapon. And I would say that a bioweapon is probably, I actually don't know this, but a bioweapon seems to be um, cheaper in some sense than, like a whole infantry of tanks, or even like a nuclear weapon. Um, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And the reason being is that for the most part, you can um, one automate most of the labor. For example, in the construction of a tank, but you can't automate a lot of the labor into producing a virus. Um, and so if you were trying to create or weaponize a virus, you would, like I mentioned, you would have to put in a lot of resources. It would be a lot of time, a lot of coordination to actually try to get that virus out in a relatively easy way to spread it, cause a lot of basically points of contact for people to actually spread that virus. And for example, people could say the best place to put the virus or something would be, like the Chinese markets or whatever, because a lot of people go there. I mean, for example, even China, just weaponizing the virus in China would be beneficial, just because there's such a large volume of people that there's a lot of point of contacts. They're sending things. China has like a lot. It's one of the biggest distributors of resources in the world, second to the United States. And so, for example, we have like a lot of points of contact, like I mentioned, which you can basically get that virus going to different points. I mean, the biggest points you would want to target would be developed countries like the United States, the European Union, a lot of those, developed countries with large populations of people. Um, and like, again, it's not that it's not easy to weaponize a virus, but for example, the virus doesn't need to. It wouldn't need to be weaponized in a way where you would, put it in the fluoride. I mean, not put it in fluoride, put it in the water system and then spread it that way. Like viruses are already good. Fighting the mechanisms that implements in its what would you call it? Its reproductive cycle. Not that viruses are life, but for example, just getting sick with a fever, for example, is one of the symptoms of a virus. And so, for when you start, spewing out your basically your insides, then the virus spreads that way. But like I mentioned, it would take a lot of resources just in general to try to weaponize a virus, that it doesn't seem like the most viable conclusion, or the most, what would you say, the most likely outcome, or most likely thing that people would do. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on if I think this was planned. I don't think China planned to fuck up their economy, for example. And I don't think the United States planned to fuck up their economy either, which is another thing that it leads into. It's like there's a lot of repercussions in a pandemic, not just like economically, but infrastructurally. And if these countries are so reliant on these systems, why would they cripple themselves in such a way, to such a degree that they seem to be right now? It just doesn't make sense. And then, like I mentioned, if anybody coming in, if the audio is pretty bad, just let me know in the comments. That way I can adjust it, or at least make it better, so that, obviously you guys aren't suffering through shitty audio. But yeah, I'm basically just answering questions in this live stream. And so the second question is in regards to a meme. It's a meme that's basically, it says in the caption, I'll probably just show it on my phone. I know that's kind of crude, but let's see. I just need to pull it up. Yeah, I wish I had way better setup, but we do what we can, kings. Let's see here. Okay, so it's basically this meme, and it's if you can't see that or can't read that, it's basically the saying I'm young, so I don't care about corona is the same as saying as I'm old, so I don't care about climate change. And that's kind of funny, to be honest. It's a good meme, but I don't think they're equivalent. For example, saying that I'm young, so I don't care about corona, is in regards to a pandemic that can affect basically anyone that gets in contact with someone that could potentially carry the virus. The points of contact determine whether or not you actually get sick, whether or not you're actually exposed to the virus itself, determines whether or not you're actually at risk to get sick with COVID-19. It's different than, for example, if something like climate change, not that it's not prominent or it's a thing that's happening, but for example, once climate change really starts causing significant effects, the point that no one can ignore, capitalism itself wouldn't even be able to ignore its own contradictions. For example, of climate change, it's using up all of these resources. They're finite. Once it uses up all of the oil to basically keep this exponential growth, then there's two things that are happening with that. It's the consumption of resources which are not being replenished at a fast enough rate, and then the second part would be climate change has a significant impact, not just to the people, you could say at the socioeconomic strata that's pretty low, but it also has an impact just in general to people even at a high strata, or a high class, whatever you want to call it. And the reason is because everybody basically lives on the same planet or the same earth. And so, yes, you could say that the high class or the bourgeoisie or whatever, I don't care what you call them, these people living in this high strata of socioeconomic wealth or whatever, they could handle the situation of something like global warming or the climate change to a higher degree, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't actually like have an effect, like get affected by it. Um, and like one of the biggest example is, for example, you have like what is it called? You have like places like in California or even like New York or like tech companies, for example. One of their biggest things is to moving towards renewable energies. For example, Apple recently did this with their campus, and they're not doing it because it's cool and edgy or whatever to be one of those corporations that uses less resources or whatever. In part, that's true because they want to basically be avant-garde about their politics or about how they tackle something like climate change. But they're doing it because, for example, if capitalism is this process of basically flushing out the contradictions in itself and then somehow overcoming them, then it would even have to overcome something like climate change or global warming. And for example, I think even Mark Fisher talks about this in one of his essays. I think it's Avatar versus Terminator. And he mentions how capitalism, at least at this point, cannot overcome all of its contradictions, or if it tries to, that it can't what is it called, deal with the trauma. For example, the movie WALL-E, I think Mark mentions that that movie in itself can't overcome its own contradictions of something like late stage or global capitalism. And the whole movie's message is, for example, trying to convey this message. It's like a green critique, right? Like we can't destroy the planet. We can't use up all these resources. We can't create a wasteland. Sorry, because it's basically not beneficial for the human species. First of all, capitalism doesn't care about people. It only cares about the concentration of capital in itself. And the second part of that is that WALL-E, like I mentioned, shows that capitalism can't overcome its own contradiction, because the criticism of WALL-E is that it's a green critique against basically climate change, against the forces of capitalism and climate change overall. But at the same time, the movie itself is a commodity which you purchase to kind of alleviate your feelings of basically this human annihilation that's predicated on consumption. And to further extend this point, for example, the thing that really kind of gets pointed out in this essay by Mark Fisher is that, for example, he mentions that these green critiques that are propagating in culture and things like media, like television, books, and even, for example, even like corporate policy. The thing with those things is that there's this sense of this return to nature, as if there is this, you could say, this mode of being which is removed from humans, almost like humans are separate from nature itself, and that nature is this this mode of being, for example, that we could return to if we really wanted to, either by decelerating the amount of production or the amount of consumption, sorry, or the way that we produce certain goods and resources. But the thing is, that's not really the case. If that was really the case, for example, in the movie Avatar, that's why it's called Terminator versus Avatar. It's because in the movie Avatar, for example, I forgot what the blue people are called, but basically it's this whole narrative of a return to nature, of overcoming the corporate. Well, I forgot what the corporation was, but they created the blue people, basically. Well, they didn't create them, but they created the avatars, which is, the people that you could basically log into their mind, and they created them so that they could have good relations with the people, so that eventually they could blow up that tree for all that resource. I forgot what they were digging. It's like some mineral that was worth a lot of money. And the contradiction in that is that the main character at the beginning of the film is working for the humans, but then he ends up working, or at the end of the movie, you realize that he ends up working for the blue people. The thing with that is that it's the criticism is a return to nature or whatever. It's a return to this primal state, this almost this state, this innate state, or this actual state that humans should be in. A primal state is usually seen as a good or better, or against capitalism, but or like not against capitalism, but against certain mechanisms in capitalism. For example, the technological aspect of constant technological progress, things like that. But then you really think about it, and it's like, no, because the same technology, the same technological process, in a way that the movie itself is criticizing, is the thing that produces the film itself. Without the technological advancements that we've had in, for example, the creation of cameras, or how small we can make them now, we wouldn't have a movie like Avatar, especially a movie like Avatar, which was revolutionary at its time because of its motion capture, which was basically what sold the movie at that time, just because everybody was like, did you see Avatar? The visual effects were so good. And you really think about it, and it's like, this kind of a similar thing with climate change in general, just with people. They usually claim, oh, like, you should recycle, or you should do these things. And it's like, yeah, you probably should, just because kind of like doing your part kind of does diminish the overall impact that you have on the environment. But the thing is, how much entropy, or like how much energy are you using to recycle those resources? It comes from somewhere. That heat to generate the necessary energy to melt down, for example, a glass bottle, is sometimes equivalent, if not more, to the energy that it took to create the bottle in the first place. And that's not to say like, oh, then recycling is debunked. No, I mean, you probably should still recycle plastics and all that stuff. But for example, the entropy that's required to heat up the glass bottle and melt it down, and then, form it into something else, that's the same amount of energy that's required to produce a new one in the first place. And the thing that's kind of ironic about that is that they use the same carbon input. Coal, for example, in a I forgot what they're called, on a furnace. The coal comes from the same place. Or if they're using like an electric furnace, then the power grid that it's hooked up to is still using up the carbon resources to actually power that electric furnace, and then actually melt down the glass, and then blah blah. And so the criticism is that there's, in a way, this you could say this ironic, how would you say it? There's this not ironic, there's this contradictory elements to certain things, or certain processes in capitalism, and capitalism has a hard time overcoming them, and that's clearly evident with, for example, like I mentioned, the movie Wall-E, because the whole movie is trying to teach you a lesson about returning to this, again, this not primal, but more natural state. At the end of the movie, they make the earth like some sort of green haven paradise, and somehow technology was seen as bad. The AI computer ship thing was seen as the bad guy, but then somehow we still get the whole movie Wall-E sold to us as a commodity. So that's like the irony in capitalism, or like the contradiction within capitalism, especially with like social criticisms. They don't usually they're good at targeting certain aspects of capitalism, but they don't go as far as to not work within the mechanism itself. So capitalism still has room to basically expand and commodify those criticisms, and it can do this basically exponentially. That's kind of one of the tenets of what would you call it, like accelerationism, but that's for a different point altogether. So yeah, I don't think that saying I'm young, so I don't care about Corona is the same thing as saying I don't care about climate change. Climate change affects pretty much everyone on the planet. Corona, same thing, but it's not the same attitude. It doesn't carry the same. For example, like coughing on someone with Corona, that's more of a, you could say, personal attack against someone, or kind of violating some part of their bodily autonomy. And for example, climate change, like a corporation dumping millions of gallons of pollutants into the water, that doesn't just have an effect on one individual person, which then could have an exponential effect on someone else based on the spread of the virus in the case of Corona, but it has not just a current impact right now in the environment and the pollution that it causes, but it also has an exponential effect in all the other, you could say, like chains of or processes that happen. For example, the pollution to the environment. Um, if it's carbon or, for example, smoke or pollutants in that sense, it just adds to the greenhouse emissions. And so I feel like they're separate issues altogether. The attitude may be similar, but altogether, even like the critiques of these two things are ultimately very or should be treated kind of differently. To just yeah, just kind of moving on to the next question: are people overreacting? Um, Yeah, let's see. I don't think people are overreacting or how would I say this? I don't think people are overreacting, but I don't think at the same time I don't think people are treating this as seriously as it needs to be treated. And this is in reference to Corona. Um, the reason being is that I think people, for the most part, at least in where I'm located in the Midwest, um, they don't really take it seriously, and the reason is because it hasn't completely taken a hold the same way that it would have taken a hold, for example, in California or New York, just because of the higher populations. Um, and so I think a lot of people right now where I'm located aren't taking it seriously. They're kind of taking it in stride, or they're kind of brushing it off as just another thing that the media kind of sensationalizes, and then next week it's like everything's back to normal. And you really look at some like a place like China, for example, and how much effort they put into kind of dealing with Corona and its spread. They didn't treat it as best as they could have. For example, I believe they kept it hidden for a pretty long time, and the doctor even that was kind of you know first kind of brought light about the coronavirus. He ended up dying, and so um, I don't think that people are overreacting, but at the same time, I don't think people are necessarily underreacting. I think once it hits you, once it actually gets to a place where you live, you may act a bit more, uh, alarmed, because obviously it's now directly impacting you in some way. Or even if like a family member, for example, were to get corona, you would obviously act way more, how would you say, panicked or anxious. And that's just obvious with the nature of how, at least how, I would say, I don't want to generalize to say humans, because I know some people aren't like this, but um, some people, at least in the West, it doesn't seem real to them until it actually affects them directly. And I think that just has to do with certain attitudes of individualism here in the United States. Um, and I think you can see that too with how, like, the Trump administration kind of is running things, and how they care more, for example, about the economy collapsing and doing its thing than human lives. By the most part, the United States has basically done close to nothing in terms of actually trying to basically keep the U.S. Or keep the coronavirus from spreading significantly. And I guess for like the most part, um, the United States basically has said just wash your hands, social distancing, quarantine, staying at home as much as possible. And those are all, obviously those are all good. They almost seem kind of obvious. Like, yeah, like you probably don't want to be, shaking people's hands, especially, at the time, particularly like February or January, where, it's kind of like cold season still. You wouldn't want to be doing that. But I think people aren't even taking that seriously. Like, for example, people here where I'm from, they're still going to the gym, or they're still, going to social gatherings. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. I don't think there's been enough cases here to draw panic. But at the same time, it's like, well, there's only been 4 cases reported, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's not more. I mean, testing, for example, is not readily available. I know that for example, some insurance companies fight about what part of the test they cover, and there's just not enough resources in general. I mean, if you talk to anybody that works at a hospital right now, they'll tell you like, yeah, they're over. Well, maybe not here in the Midwest, but for example, like in places like New York, they'll tell you like, no, like they're overbooked. I believe there was even an article today that came out, and it's like some of New York's hospitals are having such a hard time that they might even go bankrupt just because they're running out of the resources to treat people and the means to actually maintain themselves um, basically functioning. And then on top of that, it's like you're exposing healthy people, the doctors, nurses, the staff, to a bunch of people who are basically very contagious. Um, and you're exposing them to that, which just creates more opportunities for that for those points of contact for the coronavirus to spread. And the more you have that, I mean, obviously exponentially the virus can grow, and that's why the whole curve thing. It's like the whole meme. It's like flatline the curve. It's like, yeah, I mean, viruses have an exponential growth rate. Um, yeah, so like I mentioned, I don't think people are overreacting. If anything, I think I'd side more with. I'm more sympathetic, not sympathetic, but I'm more edging on the side that people are taking this. They're almost like underreacting, in a sense. And that's just not just to do with like the spread of the virus, for example. I mean, I think there's also like economic problems here. I don't think people realize the effect that the coronavirus has had on the economy, and how significant that actually really is, not just for us, regardless of what you think the criticisms of capitalism, for example, is or are, and your kind of general view of capitalism. I don't think that necessarily means that the way that the market is, I guess, like the way the market system currently works for each of one of us. Um, I don't think you're gonna have like a great time here in the next couple months, um, and that's just based on like infrastructural, um, basically weaknesses and basically collapse. Um, for example, like I mentioned, the hospital thing. It's like hospitals aren't ready for this volume of people going in so rapidly with the symptoms that they do. We're probably months away from any form of real vaccine. I know that they're doing human testing, but for the production of an actual vaccine, to get that mass produced and generalized, or basically get the formula out to um, basically private companies to be able to produce that at a large scale, like that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of infrastructure, and it takes a lot of, like, imagine all the trucks that have to drive those vaccines to the hospitals that they need to get so that people can get those vaccines administered. It's like there's this exponential growth of complex processes that go along with something like a vaccine, and I think people haven't really even considered like, I think people think, oh, they create the vaccine, it gets to me, I'm good. But it's like there's a process to creating the vaccine. There's a lot of labor inputs that go into creating the vaccine. Um, and those labor inputs, people have to basically work to create the vaccine. And if there's too many people sick, or the best advice is to self quarantine, who's going to do it? Where's the infrastructure? Where's the government funding, for example? That stuff is expensive. I mentioned the thing with the first question: do I think this was planned? It's like, no, because, for example, we can already see this with government funding. It's really expensive to start working on vaccine for like a virus, for example. Just general like viral testing is very expensive, and I don't think people think about like the cost and the resources that goes into the production of something like vaccine or a cure or treatment, or even like the infrastructure to handle any of this. And yeah, I think, like I mentioned, I think people are kind of underreacting. Maybe I think they're treating the spread of the disease okay, but I think they're not treating the long-term effects of something like a pandemic. And I think they're underreacting about those things. And let's see. The next question: will life ever go back to normal after this is over? I guess it depends what you mean by normal, right? Um, for example, if by normal you mean status quo, basically Trump administration, everything like we had in the last 6 months, um, maybe. But the thing, I guess, like the real question is like, at, at what point does this turn into something um, completely, what does you call it, like economically and sociologically catastrophic to the point that it drastically changes our forms of economic and political organization. And I think that I don't think it has hit that point where, for example, capitalism can make a comeback. But I think more and more it's getting to the point where people themselves, like individuals, are probably not going to make it back from something like this, at least at an economic level. Um, and the reason why I say that is, for example, it's the economy has been at its lowest since it's been, I believe, during the 2008 recession, and that's pretty low actually, and it actually creates like a lot of problems for people, just in general, just for one, just job seeking. Um, if there's massive unemployment, the only good thing about that is that it creates an opportunity for basically wage labor to, if there's more unemployment, wage labor goes down. Um, is more unemployment, wage, yes. And so the beneficial thing would be to get more people to be able to do like remote jobs, for example. And that's only possible, and realistically, that's only possible in some place like the United States or in developed countries, um, because they have like the infrastructure, they have the sociological and cultural, basically like jobs to do it. And then, for example, in underdeveloped countries, there still needs to be a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place to have those kinds of jobs. Like think about the United States being part of the global 1%. Um, that basically just creates an entire society that is used to these quote unquote white collar jobs, or these jobs that don't require like a lot of labor intensity, or labor intensive jobs. um, for example, in a country like Mexico, where a large chunk of the population is living basically at or below the poverty line, what kind of jobs are they used to? Are they used to having remote jobs? Are they used to having these basically being able to work from home? They really don't. It's not even sociologically or culturally, not that it's acceptable, but it's just not really something that people are used to. Um, Most of the labor, by and large, in Mexico is still labor intensive. It requires large amounts of labor input. For example, field workers, manufacturers, factory workers, etc. And these jobs, they don't just evaporate because everyone goes home and quarantines and blah blah. A lot of these jobs, like they have to be running in order to maintain the current infrastructure that we have. Um, and so, for example, if those points start failing, if the infrastructure that's already in place for capitalism starts failing, then in order for us to go back to normal, it would require a lot of people to go back to those labor intensive jobs. One, because you know poor people are more susceptible to infection from a pandemic just because of socioeconomic inequality. They don't have the same, for example, people in the United States who don't have health insurance, they're more susceptible to being infected with corona, or dying from corona because they can't go get the treatment that they need. And so a lot of these things, like being at a particular poverty line, is correlated with being infected. And at the same time, the types of jobs that you can get being at a particular social strata um, severely impacts the way that the economy works. And so I think I think people only generalize based on their experience, but they don't really take into account like the multiple real levels of social strata and economic, basically economic disparities that exist between people, and that has a real impact on exactly how those people will survive in the next coming months. And I don't think people have really thought about that. I think people are just thinking like, oh, I'm just gonna chill at home and watch Netflix and quarantine because that's what the news is telling me to do. And they really haven't thought about, oh man, who's gonna be producing, my Nike shoes or whatever. Because a lot of those factories, I mean, I know a lot of supply chains and just in general have been really impacted in the last few months in China. I know that they're doing better, and um, China has really started to maybe even regain some traction in the coming months. But we haven't even been hit to the extent that we quote unquote need to in the United States. And once we do, we're going to realize like we were not prepared. We were nobody was no to the. We're going to be looking back at this and we're going to be like, oh man, economically, infrastructurally, we were not ready for something like this. And that has to do a lot with different administrations. I don't think you can limit it to just like the Trump administration, which didn't help that he cut back a lot of government funding, which would have helped prevent a lot of this. But yeah, I think that's yeah. And so let's see. Will this change us as a society, or do you think we'll forget about it when this is over? I mean, it's changing as a society already, right? Like social distancing, for example, is seen as like a really viable option for people to basically, stay apart, not try to get infected with Corona-Chan, um, yada yada yada. Um, that's not really. I don't think that's what the question really is asking. Like, is for example, social distancing a real tangible way that it's impacted us? I mean, yes, social distancing has impacted us in the sense that people don't regularly do that, not even when it's the flu season. Like people sneeze and they go, they usually get it all over you because people are usually fucking rude. But for example, right now, what it's doing, at least sociologically, is it's getting people in like really tight spaces at home for long extended periods of time. And one of the things that I started thinking about the other day, and this, I don't try to treat this like a conspiracy theory, but one of the things that I mentioned earlier was that capitalism is really good at overcoming certain contradictions that it finds within itself. And for example, if there's like a revolutionary tendency, something that starts working against the system, then almost instantly capitalism tries to overcome it by absorbing it. It absorbs it into itself, and it basically commodifies it in some way. And like a way that you can think about this is if you've seen the movie Sorry to Bother You, one of the characters in it, one of the protesters, throws a can at I think his name's Cassius head, and that's how he gets the whole I don't know, like bandana tie thing around his head or whatever. And eventually they start making a meme out of it, and it gets so viral that the girl that threw the can gets a sponsorship with I don't know, I want to say it's Coca-Cola, but I know that it's like some in-universe soda. And so capitalism has this tendency to overcome these small points of you could call like rebellion or instigation, or these little obstacles, you could say. And so once it encapsulates them, it overcomes them, it absorbs it into itself. In a way, it grows, it gets better, it's faster, stronger. And so in that sense, capitalism is just getting us ready for more remote jobs, at least in developed countries. And I actually would want to like tie that to some accelerationist theory or theories, you could say, because if and I'm going to be using the processes of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, and that's basically what I just kind of described a little bit ago. The whole capitalism overcomes its contradictions, blah blah. So if you see the overcoming of those contradictions as you could say reterritorialization, or actually no, like you could structure it this way. Deterritorialization happens in a particular system. For example, you could see with the invention of the loom, for example, that created more. It liberated people from having to work or put so much labor into producing or a piece of fabric, for example, and it liberated them and it allowed them to have more free time. Blah blah blah. With something like Corona-chan, it's it's basically shown capitalism that if humans are very very social, if there's a lot of points of contact, then it's capable of basically almost collapsing the infrastructure that is in place. And in order to prevent something like that, what you would need to do is limit the amount of social interactions that you would need. And so, if you diminish the amount of social interactions or point of contacts for the spread of something like a virus, then you individualize more and more. You atomize basically the social behavior that exists with people, and what you get is more stuff like this. You see, like universities doing it. Universities basically. Sorry, I looked at the chat and I lost my train of thought. Universities are doing it with Zoom, for example. Teaching online, and it's not just a preventative measure, but it's also, you could say, um, sorry, it's not just universities are using it, for example, to prevent the spread, but at the same time, you think about it, some of the faculty wasn't able to get ready or, you know, um, get properly trained to actually have a proper classroom with Zoom. Um, and you think about that and it's like, okay, then it just shows that more people need to have these technological or be technically adept. Um, and the way that it atomizes the workforce is because it individualizes, it makes you kind of keep social distance from people. And the third way is that it suddenly, not only did it in a post-Fordist society, where people already taking work home, what happens now is that you work from home. So it's an aspect that capitalism, in a way, kind of reterritorialized, or it was able to grasp something that before it wasn't able to. A lot of people, they still believe in the Fordist ideal of you go to work, you work your shift, and then you go back home and work. I mean, home is for leisure, and more it seems that work is entering our homes, and it's less a space for leisure and a space for more work. So you go to work, you continue to work at home, and now it's like, why even leave your home? If you can do your job remotely, then your home just becomes another place where you do your work. So in that way, it is already changing sociologically how we behave. For example, if there's anything to be learned about Corona, is that humans are still way too social, and that at least in let's say in a process, in a positive feedback loop process that is capitalism, if a way to make it more robust, more resilient against something like a pandemic, what you would want it to do is atomize the individual to the point where the social contact inhibits any form of viral infection. And so in that sense, that's how I can see it changing us sociologically, years into the future, at least in like developed countries, and then over time just into even, for example, like, I don't know, socioeconomically, politically, in other ways. And all right, just moving on to the next question. Do I think that there will be some repercussions environmentally speaking when it passes? I think this is like a pretty good question because in a lot of ways, it's like, what does a virus have to do with like the environment? And a lot of that has to do with like how viruses themselves even spread. Come on, my cat. For example, there's a lot of ways that viruses can basically spread. There's trans-species contamination or spread, basically when it jumps from one species to another, and then that species transmits it to us. And it's usually like when a virus, for example, from a particular creature, you could think like a bat, for example. transmits that disease to another animal, like an animal that can carry that virus without necessarily, getting all symptomatic or getting sick, um, is that it's an animal that can't be. Uh, it can basically incubate the virus, but then it passes it on to humans because it's more closely related to us. And a good example of this is like cows and pigs. Um, so, for example, something like a bat, for example, or like birds can transmit that over to a pig, and then that can then transmit to humans because pigs can pigs and humans. At least when you eat the pig, if you don't cook it or you don't clean it enough, it doesn't destroy the virus, and so we consume that pig, and then it gets us sick. That's all because of, like, for example, you can think of it at this point of view of industrial farming. Industrial farming just maximizes the amount of space that, or it minimizes the amount of space that animals have between each other. And we already mentioned this, like heavily dense populations of people, they're easier to spread the virus. And so the same thing happens with animals. If there's a lot of animals in a particular condensed area, um, if they're trying to, round up as many pigs as they can because they're trying to maximize profit and all this stuff, um, they're going to get a lot of pigs sick. Those pigs get sick, they get distributed through the meat markets, and then the meat markets, people eat them, and then people get sick. You can see how this is not just an environmental thing, just in general, in terms of animals, because you can't control, for example, like a bat, biting a pig or something like that, or a pig eating something in which it gets infected with this. But you can diminish the amount of viral spread if we didn't, for example, have so many pigs or so many cows or whatever species in a condensed, closed area, and then trying to treat them with antibiotics. And this is like evidently seen in like the United States, where the largest pharmaceutical companies of things like antibiotics are actually selling their product to farm industries and not not to people. So the largest consumer of antibiotics are meat companies like Tyson, and you could even see something like that in China, for example. It's the meat markets or the wet markets, for example, which are heavily unregulated. They create basically an environment in which the virus cannot just be harvested, but it's basically they create the perfect environment for a virus to be harvested or to be incubated and then spread throughout different types of meats. And so in that sense, it's like it has a biological, environmental aspect to it. But I think the question is more in regards to like the environment, in regards to like global warming or climate change. And I mean, if the virus teaches us anything about keeping animals in close quarters, it's like you probably shouldn't do that. Um, and so I can see it being maybe used as like a potential to go against animal farming. But the whole thing is people have been trying to go against animal farming or like industrial animal farming for a while now, and they've been unsuccessful just because, one, they don't have the traction to do it, and then two, because there's way more people trying to eat meat and dairy products than there are people not trying to eat these products. One, because they're cheaper, and then two, because culturally, sociologically, we're used to eating those products, and so people are less likely to give up something that they're used to doing. And so I can see how coronavirus or the Corona Chan or COVID could be used to kind of criticize these farming practices, but I don't really see it having like a huge impact besides the fact that people aren't going out as much. There's probably not as much transportation being used right now. I know that some airlines are flying what's called like ghost flights, which is basically just so that they can keep their flight logs with a certain volume of planes flying. And the reason they do this is because of some, European regulations. I think the United States has some regulations like that too, where a certain percentage of your flights have to be, or a certain number of your potential fleet has to be in the air at particular times in order for you to get, I believe it's like subsidies, like economic subsidies, but that just shows how policy is implemented for the benefit and growth of capitalism. But basically, if there's less of these transportation methods being used, then it would have a decrease in the amount of greenhouse emissions that are being produced, and consequently, it would diminish. You could maybe see a slight curve down in overall carbon emissions, and then therefore have an impact in the environment. But I don't think that Corona-Chan will be long enough to create a significant slowdown in the carbon and methane gas emissions that are causing environmental change. I think that at this point, the only real environmental repercussions that this could have would also be infrastructural repercussions that are just like part of epidemics in general, not necessarily unique to Corona. And those would be like the ones that I mentioned earlier, which would be economic stability for a lot of people going down. And then that would create a lot of social tensions between people. And ultimately, that whole thing that I said about getting people used to working from home, blah, blah, blah. Those would be the bigger, how would I say this? Those would be the bigger repercussions from this than it having like a positive or a negative effect on the economy. I mean, on the environment. I think at this point, I guess at this point, I don't know enough about the environment, to be honest, to give a full detailed answer about that. But moving on to the last question, will the economy get worse? And yeah, it'll probably get a lot worse before it gets better. And the reason is more and more people are leaving the workforce. I know a lot of people are getting unemployment, myself included. I currently got basically I got sent home. So I'm still technically working for the company that I'm working for, but I currently have just unpaid time off. And basically, what this does for a lot of people is that it creates like a lot of socioeconomic tension for them, and that creates, first of all, if you don't have money to spend, that has a direct impact on the economy because people aren't out spending. Like economies grow based on the spending power that people have, which puts basically the flow of money that basically people produce exists, and basically that determines, like, for example, like GDP. It's just overall gross domestic production, which in some sense is directly tied to how much people spend or were able to create in the economy. And that's directly tied to like your job, for example. Like the company spends money on you by hiring you to make to basically supply their labor. And so if that diminishes for a company, basically if a company doesn't have enough employees, well then they suffer, and basically other corporations are dependent on those smaller companies to do certain functions, and that's just a chain ripple effect up and down. And so in that sense, it's like, yeah, the economy is going to be significantly impacted by Corona. And I mean, if it's not already, like, I mean, I already mentioned earlier in the podcast or in this live stream that basically Corona, or basically that the United States has had its lowest, one of its lowest, I don't know, how would I say this? The economy has been at its lowest since the 2008 recession. And so, yeah, I think the economy will just keep getting worse. How worse? I don't know. I'm not an economist, but enough to the point that I think people should probably be worried. Maybe not to the point where you should probably be like plucking your hair out and taking all your money out of the bank and putting it in Ziploc bags and then burying it in your backyard. But I think to the point where you might see a lot of people, at least like working class people, really struggle in the next year and the next following years. And like I said, I think this has like a ripple effect. Just because you can't see this happen in the next week or in the next month doesn't mean that it won't have significant effects following. Like, for example, like I think Q3 of this year, Quarter 3, if you think about it in terms of like production and basically how much money corporations make. Um, Quarter 3 is, I think, it's projected to be one of the lowest quarters. Obviously, since the 2008 recession, but just it's like for example, even like Sony and Apple have been having a terrible time getting the components that they need for the next iPhone and for the next PlayStation. Um, and that has like a real significant impact on how the prices will be this upcoming fall. I can easily see how the iPhone originally may have been priced at a particular price range that's within reason, but I can definitely see it go way up just based on the current supply chains and the supply chain restrictions that have been implemented basically because of Corona. Um, but yeah, I think that's it. I mean, that's all the questions that I have. We've been going for about an hour. At this point, the 8 people who are watching, do you guys have any questions? You can leave something in the comments, and I'd be more than happy to answer those questions. Probably just give a few, quick replies if anybody has anything to ask or say. Or, but yeah, I mean, this is my first live stream, so looks like it was pretty fun. It's kind of different than recording a podcast and then being able to edit it and then sending it out to people. And I think a lot of that just has to do with actually having a live audience to be listening to you in real time. But I think that I'm just trying. I didn't post this on Instagram. Yeah, I know. I I couldn't do the live stream and then at the same time trying to manage all my social media, which I think is why the turnout is kind of low. But um, eh, you know, for next time. Um, but yeah, yeah. If any, I'm just gonna wait a little bit longer to see if anybody has any questions, and please share this with anybody who's watching this. Just share it with anybody if you thought this was worth anything. Um, it means a lot to me for you to just share it with your friends, family. So yeah, if you want to do that, please do support the channel. And yeah, I mean, I had fun here. Our live stream is going to become a regular thing. Um, at this point, yeah, I don't see why they shouldn't. I think they're kind of fun. Maybe I might do like gaming live streams. So that way that you're not just staring at me at the whole time. Like this way, it's kind of, I feel like it's a little awkward. Maybe if I am playing like a game, I probably wouldn't even show my face. I'd probably just play the game and do some commentary on the game, and people ask questions in the comments, and I can answer them while I'm playing or something. But yeah, I mean, I think I do plan to do a lot of more of these Corona-Cast series. Um, just because I feel like it's a faster way to reach a larger audience. Obviously, if you post on SoundCloud or on Spotify, you're restricting your audience to people who have Spotify as a streaming service and then who actually use SoundCloud. But I think by and large, most people get on YouTube and they use YouTube and they watch everything on YouTube. People even watch TikToks on YouTube. They don't even use TikTok. So I definitely do see myself using YouTube more as a platform for the podcast and for other side projects. At this point, I'm just kind of experimenting. This was really me just trying to get into the whole live streaming thing, just to see how comfortable I can get producing something like this. But I mean, it was a lot of fun. I definitely see myself doing more of these. I might do one if I have time. I might do one on Friday, but it really comes down to people watching, people showing support, and then having content to even talk about. Because the thing also, I think, is just talking with someone, for example, face to face or through Skype call. I think it's a lot easier to actually be able to hold a coherent thought or coherent discussion, because I can bounce off ideas. When I'm kind of talking like this, I feel like I'm just trying to talk to myself about topics that I could just think about or tweet about or whatever. But Um, yeah, it looks like we're all at a minute or an hour and five. Probably gonna wrap it up here. But yeah, if you have anybody that likes this kind of stuff, please share, like, and subscribe. Um, I'll probably do one again soon. Keep an eye out on Twitter. If you don't follow me on Twitter, it's at pop with corn, or that's POPWCORN. And you can also follow my main Twitter, which is at Cornosaurus, and that's CORNAUR, CARNASAURUS. Yeah, complicated, I know, but yeah. And then yeah, for say something for the replay. What do you mean? Yeah, and if also you should follow me on Instagram. I post basically all of the what do you call it? I post all of the promotional content of the podcast, the original, the full like SoundCloud podcasts, and then these live streams. I will do all of that through Instagram, and my Instagram is the same as my Twitter. It's at Cornosaurus, and that's CORNASAURUS. And let's see, yeah, I think um, yeah, if you like this, like I mentioned already, like and subscribe for the people that watch at a later time. I guess yeah, if you're watching this at a later time, please also like, share, and subscribe. Um, you know, uh, just show support. Honestly, like I know that I don't want to be like trying to monetize this or get like a Patreon, because at this point I don't think I even have enough viewers or whatever to monetize my content. But if you even just like, share with anybody, like just a friend, it really means a lot to me, and it really helps me out. It really helps me keep this going. So I feel like I've rambled long enough at this point, but like I mentioned, please just share this, and stay tuned. Follow my social media so that you can stay up to date, and I'll catch you in the next one.